The G7 summit in Vienna is coming to an end. For 3 days in a small French town on the lakeshore, decisions were made about things that you most likely won't be told about. At the very least, they won't fit it into a 30-second news segment. The 7 richest democracies in the world gathered at one table, and for the first time in a long while, they couldn't sign a joint document. Gentlemen, not a single one. And they couldn't do this. In fact, that's much more important than everything they managed to do. And during these 3 days, there was one phrase about Iran, after which oil prices and the fate of the war in Ukraine became inextricably linked. I promise you I'll explain this. But a bit later, because without some background, you won't understand how important it is. So here's the bottom line. In a nutshell, the G7 summit. The 50th, by the way, anniversary summit took place from June 15th to 17th in Evian-les-Bains, France, under the chairmanship, of course, of Macron. Hooray. What did they agree on? They agreed to strengthen Ukraine's air defense equipment. To provide more weapons. Well, so the war, God forbid, doesn't end. To tighten sanctions against Russia on oil and gas. And they supported Trump's framework deal with Iran. That's basically the whole thing, so to speak, in a nutshell. But if it were all that simple, I wouldn't be making this program. Because, and this is where it gets interesting, to understand what really happened in the end, right? You shouldn't look at the outcome. You should look at what went into it. Who came to this table? And most importantly, what? What did each of them really want? Because behind every beautiful word in the final statement, there is a very specific and very financial interest, which of course, well, doesn't bother anyone at all. It's absolutely unimportant, it doesn't matter. And when you see these interests, you'll interpret this summit in a completely different way. And at the end, I'll tell you one thing that might make you shudder. Whether the world still needs them. These G7, G20 or whatever, as many people think, including myself, are just an expensive show. But let's take it step by step, the balance of power. Who sat down at this table and why? Imagine a round table, right? And there are 4 powers sitting at it. And each one has its own truth, absolutely its own. And most importantly, each has its own wallet. America. Trump arrived in office with a simple philosophy, America first. He is, well, not an ideologue at all. For him, politics is the deal. He wants to resolve conflicts. To spend our time and resources fighting, right? To take unnecessary burdens off America and at the same time get benefits. That's a desire I completely share. He just, and we'll talk about this in detail, pushed through an agreement with Iran. And so, well, I think he arrived there with the feeling of a winner. Now, Europe. Let's treat Europe as one block, even though a lot of them have come there. But Europe. Let me immediately point out that Europe today can be characterized by one word. And the word, I'll come back to it, is dependence. Europe at this table, well, that's France, Germany, and Italy. Rich but weak, militarily weak countries. They're used to their problems being over there. First the Soviet Union, then Russia, then Ukraine, then the Middle East. Even though they talked a lot, made a lot of noise, and gave a lot of speeches, the decisions weren't made by them, but by uncles and aunts across the ocean. Now it's Ukraine. So Zelensky isn't invited to the summit, but he doesn't belong to the G7 anyway, right? So, I mean, he can't be a full-fledged member, so to speak. It's kind of nonsense, right? He's not a giver, he's a receiver, right? He comes on the sidelines as the asking side. His task is simple. Weapons, money, guarantees. And Russia, you might ask. Well, Russia isn't at this table right now. Not at all. That's no coincidence. Why isn't it here? A relevant, very telling story, which I'll get to soon. But first, I promised to tell you about Iran. I keep my word. Iran. 3 different interests. Here's what's interesting. America under Trump wanted a deal. and achieved some sort of framework agreement to open the Hormuz Strait, that very bottleneck or choke point for the world's oil, through which a huge number of tankers pass, to extend the fragile truce to give 60 days for negotiations. That means the conditions are, if Iran truly rolls back its nuclear program, the U.S. is ready to lift some of the sanctions. And also part of the United Nations sanctions, for Trump, this is a trophy. He brought it to Vivian and basically told his colleagues, "Look here, I can do what you can't." Well, they actually knew that before. Israel sees this completely differently. For Israel, Iran is not a deal, it's a matter of survival. Since the end of February, Israel and the U.S. have been at war, directly with Iran. And any framework agreement sounds at least alarming to Jerusalem. Won't this give Tehran a pause to catch its breath and gather strength? That's why Macron specifically emphasized a phrase that, as they say, is worth hearing. It's critically important. He said it's necessary so that Iran, Hezbollah, and Israel do not resume hostilities. Let me translate. In diplomatic terms, it means everyone understands that the ceasefire is holding by a thread. So guys, well, please just give a little, okay? That's it. Europe. In Europe, Iranian oil and stability in Iran are needed much more than in America. Why? Well, because, again, it's that word, dependence. Europe relies on Middle Eastern energy. It hits Europe. That means any spike in oil prices is a blow to Europe. And here's the promised connection. I said I'd come back to this, right? Remember this. As soon as Trump opened the Hormuz and brought down the oil price, it immediately became possible to hit Russia with oil sanctions without driving up global prices. In other words, Trump's Iran deal cleared the way for Europe to strike at the Russian budget. One event opened the door for another. In the press, they've already called it a kind of deal, Iran in exchange for Ukraine. And I don't really get into it. I don't really understand it, I think, yeah. But so to speak, I told you about it because the headlines are already full of it. That's what caught my attention. All sorts of important European newspapers are full of it, so to speak. Keep this thought in mind. We'll need it later. Why wasn't Russia there? What was Russia doing instead of joining the negotiations? Negotiations. The G7 is a club of 7 industrial democracies. The USA, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Canada, plus the European Union, represented separately, separately France, separately Germany, separately Italy, plus the European Union, and Russia was part of it, from 98 to 14. Back then it was called the G8, the 8, and 8 minus 1 minus Russia turned out to be the G7. And then in March 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. It was just excluded. Since then it's been 7. Because of that they joined, and then Russia was excluded. And they're not letting them back in. Well, at least for now they're not letting them back in. But the point isn't even about 2014 anymore. After the full-scale invasion, that's already 2022, right? Russia, well, it's an absent guest, because this, we might forgive you for some things, maybe forgive Crimea, maybe forgive this or that, but this we definitely won't forgive. So Russia has turned from, sometimes a rival, sometimes a partner, sometimes a supplier, into the main adversary. That is, it has been put, so to speak, into the same status as the Soviet Soyuz, against which this table is kind of gathering, right? You are gathering. Right? It's not that she's not here because they forgot. Oh, they forgot. Where is Russia? Damn, they forgot to invite her. No, she's not here because now she's on the other side. She's not a participant, she's the subject of the conversation. And how did Russia react to the fact that 7 powers sat down to discuss her war? Like this. And unfortunately, that's not a metaphor. Just hours before the summit opened, Russia launched hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles at Ukrainian and Russian cities. 11 people were killed. The strike also hit the Kiev Pechersk Lavra. Well, it's one of the main Orthodox shrines, an absolutely remarkable architectural building. And now, attention, this is important. I have to stop and do what we always do, separate fact from Fantasy interpretation, right? From interpretation, because fantasy is something completely different. Fact, there was a strike on the day of the summit. People died, the Lavra was affected. But the interpretation that Putin timed this on purpose to show the G7, you're sitting there calling for peace and I'm bombing, so what are you going to do about it, right? That's already a conclusion about intent. The conclusion might be logical. I actually tend to agree with it, but that's an interpretation, not an admission signed by the Kremlin. Keep this kind of discipline in mind throughout our conversation, because we'll be coming back to it again. By the way, to me, it actually seemed more like the stupidity of the Kremlin regime than a very smart move, right? Exactly, because if Moscow wanted to make the G7 look weak, yeah, then it actually gave the G7 a reason to tighten the screws. The European Union quickly announced new sanctions on Russia's military industry and shadow fleet, and statements were made not only at the G7 by those who attended. Kyiv, China, and Iran also made their own statements. And these days, so to speak, of course, a lot of people were paying attention to politics, to actions, to all sorts of gestures, and everyone who could was making statements. And again, we'll talk a bit more about this later. China spoke about unfair accusations and about the West destabilizing the world. There, Iran talked about being committed to agreements. Iran is committed to agreements, yes. And our water is in the form of steam. I don't know, that's a bad comparison, sorry, yeah. So, but he is committed to agreements, but he won't tolerate pressure. That is, alongside the G7, there were a whole series of voices, and everyone was trying to pull things their own way. And now I want to lead you to the hottest topic, yes, to what basically made this summit start to crack at the seams. Because, as we've already said, it started to crack at the seams. It's reported that Trump argued, well, it was said, with almost everyone at the table. Basically with everyone. And this is where we get to the part that's worth spending a little more time on. Because usually this is explained to us as, well, Trump just argues with everyone, that's just his personality. But I want to offer you a more interesting explanation. And I promise you right away, in a couple of minutes, I'll show you an example about cars, after which everything will become as clear as day. Not like a shadow on a fence, but as clear as day. Yes, but first the main point. What were you arguing about? Well, not because of the protocol, right, but because of money and strategy, which are connected. Money and strategy. First, trade and tariffs. Trump protects American factories with tariffs on European goods. But U.S. tariffs on German cars and Italian wine are a direct blow to German and Italian manufacturers. What is good for Trump voters hurts an ally financially. There are no right or left sides here, it's just, hey, my factory against your factory. Second, how should we deal with Russia and Iran? Trump is bargaining and looking for deals. Some Europeans think this is too soft. That is, they wouldn't go to war, but you should be tougher. In other words, it's a dispute over the price of services. So, what price can or should the U.S. pay for something they're involved in? They didn't want to participate. Well, like an electoral system, right? When people go to vote, they vote for how much money you should give them. Here's the promised example, the clearest one. Giorgia Meloni, accordingly the Prime Minister of Italy, well, according to all the textbooks, she is the person closest to Trump at the table. Yes, ideology. She is right-wing, she is a nationalist, she is a Eurosceptic. She should stand, agreed, shoulder to shoulder. And what then? She still argues with him. Why? Gentlemen, when it comes to money, let me translate this from street language to diplomatic. It's about tariffs on Italian cars and cheese. And Meloni isn't defending a wrong idea, she's defending Italy. Her job isn't to be Trump's ideological ally. Her job is to stand up for her country, because for her, and you'll soon see this for yourself, Italy comes first. And here's the conclusion that follows from all this. Write it down, it's key. The rift at this summit wasn't about ideology, it was about national interest. The US against everyone else at once, and that's much more serious. Ideas, military alliances, they're so flexible, yes, they're easy to reorganize. But when fundamental, real, actual financial interests of countries collide, whose factory will survive, whose factory will disappear? Who pays whom? These are the cracks. Deep ones, and they last longer. Maloney is here. She's a litmus test. If even she's against it, it's not about opinions. Now, what did Trump not expect from Europe at all? That is what I truly consider the heart of this story, or what people don't say out loud. Trump understands perfectly well that Europe is not obligated to help America. No one owes anyone anything. By the way, that's my favorite idea too. But he was actually sure, and to be honest, so was I, that Europe at least wouldn't interfere, that it would calmly let America do what America is already doing for everyone, to solve global problems. And what he didn't expect at all was that Europe would start throwing a wrench in the works. And here's the bitter truth for Europe, which Trump essentially brought and dumped on the table. Most of the problems we're discussing are yours. European, not American. War in Europe. Guys, this war is in Europe, not America. Energy from the Middle East, the Strait of Hormuz, stability around Israel and Iran. What are you talking about? You need this much more than we do across the ocean. And Trump is increasingly annoyed by one European habit, so that their European problems are solved by him or someone else, and it doesn't matter who. But the main thing is that it's not them, so that it would be done from across the ocean and they wouldn't be responsible for anything. With money, weapons, and soldiers, they would still keep up appearances and they would benefit. This is the word I asked you to remember, dependence. Here it plays at full volume. Europe wants to be protected and at the same time wants to dictate to its protector how he should behave. In other words, conditions, terms. Well, that's not how it works, ladies and gentlemen. That only happens in some other world, not the one Trump lives in. Well, and if it does happen, it doesn't last long. Let's go over what was actually adopted. I'll focus on the main things, those that concern us in the war. For Ukraine, it literally states unwavering support for freedom, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and values. Unwavering. That sounds powerful. But really, listen closely, this is a declaration. This is a declaration of principle. And what we're supposed to do, if anything, isn't mentioned there. It's a nice frame, but it doesn't obligate anyone to anything. We firmly support it. Well, all right. Well, but we're getting in the way of your fight, so we'll step aside now. There. Now, specifically, increase air defense. Good, interceptors. And a new word. By the way, that was interesting, right? Long-range capabilities. For 4 years, they offered no long-range capabilities, but now they're suddenly discussing them. Now, this is about the weapons that strike deep into Russia. Before, they used to avoid that word. Its appearance now, that's real escalation. Do you realize this is real escalation? I understand that Ukrainians want this. Yes. Great. It's decided. But this is escalation. And next comes the tricky one, the tricky part. We are ready to consider licenses for weapons production inside Ukraine. What? Are you kidding? You don't give Ukraine licenses, right? You don't even consider it. Are you ready to consider it? In diplomatic language, this means, we're not promising you anything. Leave us alone. It's a concession to those who don't want to give too much and too quickly. Well, read Trump, right? But why? If it's possible to write, then that means America is considering it. What technologies can Europe transfer to Ukraine? It's completely unclear because their technologies are American. And now is the right time for sanctions on oil and gas. That's what they wrote. But why is now the right time? Well, I promised you that everything would come together, right? Here it is, because the Iran deal brought down the price of oil, and now they can hit Russian oil without bankrupting themselves. Hooray! And now here's what is not in this announcement, statement, proclamation. And the silence here speaks louder than anything, as if there's not a single word about negotiations in the text. Ceasefire. Peace. Not a word about security guarantees for Ukraine. The document is entirely about weapons and pressure. This is a deliberate choice. The G7 is telling Russia, don't let negotiations happen, and the cost of the war for you will only keep rising. Remember this. Because now I'm going to ask an uncomfortable question that will make us feel uneasy. But who actually wants the war to end? Who? Now we've come to the hardest part. I debated for a while whether to speak up, but since I'm being interviewed, I decided to answer their questions. Let me express this in my own show as well. Honestly, if you look at the interests, almost no one at that round table is truly interested in ending the war. And now I'll show you why, one by one, and at the very end. Who is actually sincere, the exception? Take a guess. You get 4 guesses. Europe is somehow not cynical, so it's very convenient that Russia is stuck. The enemy is bogged down, drained, and occupied. And now I'm moving on to interpretation, to suspicion. I often warn you about this. Huge amounts of money are being pulled out of European budgets and sent to Ukraine. And I have a suspicion. I emphasize it's an unproven fact that some of this money will be siphoned off along the way. Money is like dirt and water. Yes, it settles. That's exactly what, as we now know, the Democratic Party of the United States of America did. Only now are we starting to deal with our American affairs, with how one specific party here has been stealing and was corrupt for years under the guise of good intentions. By the way, corruption always goes under the guise of good intentions, not just in most cases, probably always. And it looks more and more like the next in line is to deal with the Europeans. Because where our money was going, we also can and have the right to look into it. And it looks more and more like the next and the next and the next revelations will lead us to even greater and greater horror and disgust, naturally. Gentlemen, there is a huge amount of money. Oh, guys, they had a good time there. I'm afraid the pit has been discovered. Russia. Putin doesn't want to stop the war. And he has 3 solid reasons for that. The first one, he can't declare victory yet. And to pull out without a resounding victory like that, well, I don't know. Let's just say people won't understand. Second, he'll have to bring home hundreds of thousands of soldiers. According to various estimates, about 700,000 people. That's an army of unemployed, angry people with combat experience inside the country. Not great. Yeah. It would be nice, right? Third, the military factories that are now running at full capacity will have to be urgently converted back to civilian production. And that's a blow to the economy, which is only surviving because of the war. Stopping is very much against their interests on all 3 counts at once. And here's the thing. There's a separate twist that, in fact, very few people actually talk about. Russia is not interested in the Iran issue coming to an end. Why? Why? Well, first of all, Iran is an ally, and if Russia betrays it, it will lose face in front of everyone who relies on it. Secondly, this is purely about money. If sanctions are lifted from Iran, Iran will flood the market with a huge amount of oil. And cheap Iranian oil is, well, I don't know, direct competition for Russian oil. For Moscow, that's like a knife to the gut, as they used to say, right? Thirdly, the longer America gets bogged down in the Middle East, the fewer resources it has for Ukraine. It's better for Russia if things keep smoldering there as long as possible. Ukraine. It's a bit more subtle here. Ukrainians are people. They want the killings to stop. And that's understandable. It's natural from a human perspective. But to stop the fighting and decide which part will go to Russia, as I already explained in the previous program, are completely different things. Two very different things. Legally, Ukraine cannot give up its land. Because we have a constitution, a referendum, and the principle that aggression can't be rewarded. So in a way, they're constrained by the situation here too. Just wanting it to end at any cost won't be enough. So what remains? There is one person left. Donald J. Paradoxically, this is the only one. Why Stallone? Who really wants to end this war? That's it. Because for him, it's not about ideology or profit, it's an unfinished deal, a pending project that's in the way. It gets in the way of moving forward. It gets in the way of changing the world. It gets in the way of creating a new world order so that these stupid things called wars don't exist. That's the whole picture for you. The one portrayed as a violator and a destroyer is actually the only one who wants peace. And those who say beautiful words about unwavering support, they're not really interested in peace when it comes to their own interests. Did you notice what a strange, contradictory picture this is? And now perhaps the most troubling part. Ukraine is being invited to the European Union. Well, you might say, alas, of course. Yes, what nonsense. Forget about it. Very well. Ukraine has long wanted to join the European Union. There have even been entire revolutions over this, right? Let me tell you a little bit about what all this means, gentlemen, because it might be more important than everything else. Europe is offering to accept Ukraine into the European Union. It sounds absolutely noble, but let's think about what this really means. I'll give you the exact phrase. It's from the founding treaty of the EU, the European Union. In the treaty, there's Article 42, Paragraph 7. I'm quoting verbatim. If a member state becomes the victim of armed aggression on its territory, Ukraine, right? They accepted it, and it became the victim of aggression on its own territory. Other member states are obliged to provide it, that is, such a state, with assistance and support. But how? Maybe go to the UN? No, by every means at their disposal. Every means. With airplanes, tanks, cannons, personnel, food, anything at all. Nuclear umbrellas. These words. Every means at their disposal. That is the core. This is not just empty talk. This is not just concern. This is not the Budapest Memorandum being stirred up. This is not just condemnation. This is soldiers, weapons, direct involvement. This is the obligation to enter the war. In other words, let's put two and two together. If Ukraine joins the European Union while it's at war with Russia, yes, because they're planning to do it right now. That means it automatically means that all of Europe, under this article, is obligated to enter the war with Russia. In other words, it's the beginning of World War III. But listen, without the United States of America on their side, because the U.S. is not part of the European Union. That's how it is. They're not a member. And I ask a direct question. But why? Who in the European Union benefits from this? The people. Why drag an entire continent to the brink of a major war? I'm not saying that this is a deliberate plan. Yes, that's my question, my concern. And I'm honestly labeling it as an interpretation. But the question is legitimate. Anyone who thinks is obliged to ask it. Why would Europe push the world toward the start of another world war? I understand that the time has come. I understand, what do we call it, so to speak, up and down, more and less conflicts. The same thing happens with anti-Semitism, right? People thought and lived, nothing. It came back again, almost the same as it was in the 1930s of the last century. There is also a secondary reason to invite Ukraine to the EU, and it's definitely not about nobility. Europeans are in a panic that after the war, Ukraine will start producing goods. Which will do what? Outcompete German, French, and Italian goods. That means Ukraine will make things cheaper and more modern, without the burden of unions and old obligations that weigh down old Europe. A free, hungry-for-work Ukraine is a competitor, one that will take away clients. And how do you neutralize a competitor? That's right. Let him in. Under your own rules, under your own regulations, so that he plays to your tune. Well, you yourselves call it go ahead, say what it's called. But the word nobility just doesn't come to mind. And the third reason, it's cynical but very simple. If Ukraine is a member of the European Union, then its army automatically becomes the army of the European Union. And that's the bitter truth. Almost no EU country. Today, there isn't even a capable army, let alone an equal one. They've been saving on defense for decades. I don't know, I mean, you hide behind the American umbrella, but here you have a ready, battle-hardened, capable army, the most capable on the continent, Ukraine's. Do you understand? Why? They're calling. Again, there's no nobility left there, in my opinion. There's no trace of it at all. So, add it up. Add it up. By any means, don't let the war end. By any means, drag Ukraine into the European Union. By any means, squeeze money out of your own people and send it over there. 3 lines, but if you look closely, the interest behind them is the same. One, just one. And here is my main conclusion. Actually, the very reason for everything, there was no joint communique. There was essentially discord, and this leads to a thought much bigger than just one summit. What if all these structures, the G7, the G20, all those other Gs, yes, no longer work? What if they're just expensive decorations? I don't know. Ones that get in the way and spend money rather than actually solving anything or helping. Platforms where nothing can be resolved because everyone has their own interests, and no one is ready to sign a joint document. And it seems more and more that Trump's awkward but honest idea that negotiations should be one-on-one, face-to-face, makes sense. Even though it may seem outdated, uninspired, and rough, it's the only approach that brings results. At a table of 7, everyone pulls in their own direction. But face-to-face, at least you can shake hands on it. And the last thought, which many won't like, many, but I'll say it. When everyone is responsible for safety, in reality, no one is actually responsible. But when the strongest state in the region is responsible for security, and anyone who violates that security gets, let's say, hit over the head with something very heavy, right? Then, strangely enough, order is established, right? Are you surprised? Yes, there is a danger in this. The strongest can slowly start to dominate and take over the others. It's a real risk. I'm not hiding it. But let's be honest. At this stage, when the alternative is endless wars that could escalate into a nuclear one, it's an easy choice. Maybe. For now, it's the lesser of 2 evils. Well, for now, because maybe later we'll come up with something else, something more. Maybe it's what Trump is proposing. Not to fly out of America from one end of the world to the other, not to try to solve all the issues, but to say, guys, in this region, this country, or these 2 or 3 countries unite together and become the defenders of humanity's interests. And in this region, this is how it is. I'm not happy about it. I'm just calling things what they are. And I'll finish, as always, by saying that after all, there is a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. The world has faced the brink multiple times and retreated. It was on the verge of collapse when an agreement seemed impossible, yet it still pulled through. Because in the end, for every ordinary person, I don't know, I don't like the word normal. It's not clear what that even means, just for a person, right? Homo sapiens, just a person. So what about him? Whether he lives in Ohio or Lyon or Kiev or somewhere in Bangladesh. He doesn't need war. He needs simple things. To work, to raise children. To spend time with friends. To have a normal family situation where he can come home and feel warmth and joy, right? To be able to say what he thinks. It's also important that no one takes away his life, his belongings, or his right to make decisions for himself. And most people are like that. Unfortunately, as always, they are the silent majority, but they are the majority. On my main channel, I mean, what you're watching right now is the main channel, I also have other channels. Every day, I analyze what really lies behind the pretty pictures in the news. Sometimes twice a day. Lately, it just so happens that it's even twice. And the roots of all this, why people are deprived of choice at all and how to prevent it from happening again, we dig all the way to the bottom to another channel, a roadmap to freedom, twice a week, not every day, not 10 times, yes, twice a week. For those who like to think, subscribe in both places and take care of your head. It's your most important real estate in the world. See you soon.